In case you hadn't noticed, the college football that your grandfather remembers is long gone. With the first ever 12-team playoff kicking off this year, and your favorite team's backup linemen raking in money from the NIL, the sport is officially morphed into a pseudo-professional league. If you love the changes, then this year's playoff validated its existence, featuring a national championship matchup with two teams that wouldn't have made the 4-team format of years past. And if you hate it, then it diluted the quality of the regular season. Now you can get manhandled at home by Northern Illinois, or let your 5-loss arch rival plant its flag on your home turf and still get a chance to compete for a title. Maybe this is just what the future of the sport is going to look like. Talented teams moonlighting as underdogs, peaking in December and January to win when it matters most. Or perhaps the new age juggernaut is just going to win 16 or 17 games to run the table rather than the old standard of 14 or 15. But instead of peering into the crystal ball to speculate on what the future may hold, let's rewind to 2014 and officially close the book on the 4-team playoff era by ranking every iteration of the college football playoff thus far. At the bottom of my rankings is the 2020 postseason, forever linked to the shadow of the COVID-19 pandemic. The season itself seemed to occur in this bizarre alternate reality. Travel restrictions led to mismatched schedules where you had Alabama playing 11 regular season games, while Ohio State only played 6, and limited attendance at games drained the energy from normally electric playing environments. Entering the playoffs, there were 3 clear contenders. You had top seed Alabama, number 2 Clemson, and number 3 Ohio State. And then rounding out the 4-team group was Notre Dame, who actually participated as a member of the ACC this season and earned their spot thanks to a double overtime win against a Clemson team that was without Trevor Lawrence. Unfortunately, instead of delivering an exciting end to a real downer of a college football season, the playoff matchups themselves were pretty lackluster. Per ESPN's S&P Plus metric, Notre Dame's 2020 team is the second weakest participant of the entire playoff era, while Alabama, who they would face in the semifinals, rates as the second best. Alabama featured its most explosive offense of the entire Nick Saban era, behind All-American seasons from quarterback Mac Jones and running back Najee Harris, as well as a historic Heisman campaign from wide receiver Devontae Smith, who in Jerry Rice fashion put up ridiculous numbers despite a shortened season. Predictably, Alabama dismantled Notre Dame 31-14 in the semifinal, which was technically billed as the Rose Bowl, but was actually played at Cowboys Stadium due to the pandemic. The most compelling game of the playoffs was Ohio State's 21-point demolition of Clemson in the other semifinal. The Buckeyes were fueled by revenge after losing to Clemson in the previous year's playoff, and Justin Fields delivered a masterpiece, throwing 6 touchdowns on a helpless Clemson secondary. Their dominant performance set up a highly anticipated title clash with Alabama, but the Crimson Tide left no doubts about their superiority. Mac Jones and Devontae Smith completely shredded Ohio State's defense to the tune of 52 points, securing Nick Saban's final championship win, and cementing this team as, frankly, one of the most dominant in college football history. My 10th ranked college football playoff is from the 2018 season, which was a season defined by a clear gap between the nation's top 2 teams, Alabama and Clemson, and the rest of the country. Alabama featured one of the most talented offensive rosters that we've ever seen. Their quarterback room alone consisted of 3 future NFL starters, Tua Tagovailoa, who is the Heisman runner-up this season, his backup Jalen Hurts, who he'd stolen the starting job from, and third-stringer Mac Jones, who we just talked about in leading Alabama to a title only a couple of years later. Their backfield was even more stacked with 5 future NFL running backs, while the receiving core consisted of 4 future first-round picks in Jerry Jeudy, Devontae Smith, Jalen Waddle, and Henry Ruggs. Clemson also had its fair share of talent as well, led by freshman phenom Trevor Lawrence at quarterback and standout playmakers like Travis Etienne, T. Higgins, and Hunter Renfrow. The entire season felt like a collision course between these two giants, with the programs having already met in 2 of the previous 3 national title games and each of the last 3 playoffs. And both teams delivered on those high expectations, entering the playoffs undefeated. 3-seed Notre Dame and 4-seed Oklahoma had great seasons as well, but neither proved threatening in the end. Notre Dame entered the playoffs undefeated, but were thoroughly outclassed by Clemson in a 30-3 semifinal blowout. Oklahoma brought a little more intrigue. They had Heisman-winning quarterback Kyler Murray and elite receivers like Hollywood Brown and CeeDee Lamb, but their defense was no match for Alabama. They fell into a 28-0 hole and never climbed out, losing by double digits in the semifinals. So with the formality of the semifinals complete, we had the epic championship matchup we'd all been expecting. But in a shocking turn of events, Clemson completely took over the game. Explosive playmaking from Trevor Lawrence in the passing game, combined with some untimely interceptions from Tua Tagovailoa, allowed Clemson to pull away in the second half for a resounding 44-16 victory, securing their second national title in 3 seasons. My 9th ranked postseason is from 2021, which brought a welcome return to normalcy as many of the COVID-related restrictions from the previous year were lifted. Once again, there were 2 powerhouse programs in Alabama and Georgia battling for supremacy throughout the season and culminating in a title game rubber match that we'll come back to shortly. Much like the 2018 season, the presence of 2 overmatched teams in number 2 Michigan and number 4 Cincinnati prevents this playoff from elevating higher up the list. Michigan, who was making the first of 3 consecutive playoff appearances, began the season unranked, which really reflected a roster quality that was still building to compete with the top echelons of the sport. But they were powered by the best defensive player in the country, defensive end Aiden Hutchinson, and the leadership of head coach Jim Harbaugh, which was enough to notch a program-defining win over Ohio State to secure a playoff berth. Ultimately, their talent limitations were exposed in a semifinal matchup with Georgia, with the Bulldogs cruising to a 34-11 win. While Michigan deserves all the credit in the world for dethroning Ohio State in the Big Ten, I tend to think an Ohio State team led by C.J. Stroud throwing to Garrett Wilson, Chris Olave, and Jackson Smith and Jigba might have posed a more competitive threat in the playoff. As for Cincinnati, while they played outside of a major conference, they weren't your typical Cinderella team. They actually started the year ranked in the top 10 and eventually became the first group of 5 team to make the playoff. Led by quarterback Desmond Ridder and boasting an elite secondary with Sauce Gardner and Kobe Bryant, the Bearcats earned a key road win against a top 10 Notre Dame team that made their playoff case undeniable. But, like Michigan, they were hit with a hard dose of reality in their semifinal matchup against Alabama, managing only 218 total yards of offense in a 27-6 defeat. And so the championship game was set, with Alabama and Georgia meeting once again after Alabama had spoiled Georgia's perfect season in the SEC title game a month prior. The moment couldn't have been any larger for Georgia, who hadn't won a national championship since 1980. The game began as a back-and-forth field goal affair, with Georgia scoring the game's first touchdown late in the third quarter. But early in the fourth quarter, the ghosts of Georgia's haunted past had resurfaced when Alabama forced a sack fumble and took the lead on a Bryce Young touchdown pass. But the Dogs refused to follow the same script of years past, and in a storybook finish, Stetson Bennett, the former walk-on quarterback, calmly orchestrated 2 straight touchdown drives to give Georgia a 26-18 lead. Then, with Alabama driving late in the fourth quarter to tie the game, cornerback Keely Ringo picked off Bryce Young and returned it 79 yards for a game-sealing touchdown, ending 41 years of championship frustration in the process. In 8th place is the 2015 playoff, the second iteration of the 4-team bracket, and the beginning of one of college football's most iconic rivalries between Clemson and Alabama. At the time, Clemson's program was still shaking off its reputation for Clemsoning or collapsing in big moments. But armed with a superstar quarterback, Deshaun Watson, and a fearsome defensive front featuring studs like Carlos Watkins, DJ Reader, and Shaq Lawson, Clemson overwhelmed the ACC and claimed the number 1 seed in the playoff after an undefeated season. But standing in their way was Alabama, coming off what, by their standards, was an unthinkable 2-year title drought. Their roster was of course full of NFL caliber talent, essentially answering the question of what an NFL team would look like with Jacob Coker as the quarterback, running back Derrick Henry, who bulldozed his way to a Heisman Trophy, Calvin Ridley emerged as a standout wide receiver, and the defense had too many future NFL stars to name all of them. We're talking guys like Jonathan Allen, Minkah Fitzpatrick, Marlon Humphrey, and Eddie Jackson. It's surprising then, given the strength of the top 2 teams in the field, that this playoff field overall rates as the weakest of the entire playoff era, weighted down significantly by the presence of number 3 Michigan State. According to ESPN's S&P Plus metric, Michigan State ranks as the weakest playoff team we've ever seen in this era. Their journey to the playoff was nothing short of magical, highlighted by the infamous fumbled punt and subsequent return in the Michigan game, and an epic road win over Ohio State, who were the defending national champions and arguably the most talented team in the country. But their magic abruptly ran out in the semifinals, where the Spartans lost to Alabama 38-0. Oklahoma was the playoff's number 4 seed, a talented team in Baker Mayfield's first year as the starter, but the young roster surrounding him was still a couple years away from peaking. The Sooners actually entered their semifinal matchup against Clemson as the betting favorites, illustrating how little the public believed in Clemson's success at that point in time. But Clemson delivered the first of many statement performances during their golden era, turning a 17-16 halftime deficit into a commanding 37-17 win. This set up the first of several title fights between Clemson and Alabama, and this was a good old-fashioned shootout. The game was tied in the fourth quarter when Alabama pulled a rabbit out of its hat with a perfectly executed onside kick, swinging the momentum in their favor and leading to a go-ahead touchdown by O.J. Howard. Clemson responded with a field goal, cutting the deficit to 4, but Alabama never let them get any closer, putting the game away with Kenyon Drake's 95-yard kickoff return for a touchdown and adding another late-scoring drive after that. Despite the narrow loss, Clemson sent a resounding message that they belonged on the national stage. Deshaun Watson set a title game record with 478 total yards, laying the groundwork for an all-time rematch the following year that would elevate this new rivalry to a legendary status. Coming in at number 7 is our most recent postseason, the first ever 12-team playoff. Part of what made this season overall so compelling was the perceived lack of an overwhelmingly dominant team, creating a sense that the championship was truly up for grabs. But while the national title game technically matched the number 7 and number 8 seeds against one another, the postseason didn't quite deliver the chaos fans had hoped for. Across the 11 games played, the betting favorite won every single matchup. Still, the playoff had its classic moments. Arizona State came within a fourth down stop of shocking Texas in the quarterfinals. Notre Dame and Penn State had an old school clash in the semis, with Drew Aller's fourth quarter meltdown tilting the game in favor of the Irish. But in the end, these developments felt secondary to a dominant Ohio State team. Despite entering as the number 8 seed, the Buckeyes were the furthest thing from a Cinderella. They began the season as the nation's number 2 team and featured an incredible collection of skill position talent, headlined by an all-time great wide receiver prospect in Jeremiah Smith, and a defense stacked with future NFL talent like Caleb Downs, Jack Sawyer, and JT Tuimoloau. After tearing through the first 2 rounds of the playoff, they faced a stiff test from Texas in the semifinals, but Jack Sawyer's sack and fumble return for a touchdown put the game away and stamped his name in Buckeyes lore. In the national title game, they overwhelmed Notre Dame, jumping out to a 31-7 lead before sweating out an Irish comeback that was too little too late. Ultimately, the defining storyline of these playoffs was the redemption of Ohio State head coach Ryan Day, whose job was on thin ice entering the playoff after the embarrassing home loss to Michigan. In years past, he may have lost his job entirely, but in college football's new age, the most talented team in the country was able to put it together at just the right time. At number 6 is the 2019 playoff, defined less by the games themselves and more by the sheer level of talent across its 4 participants. Of course, we have to start with LSU's legendary 2019 team, regarded by many as the best team of all time. Coming into the season with high expectations, LSU exceeded even the wildest projections, fueled by the meteoric rise of Joe Burrow, who transformed from a solid starter into a record-shattering Heisman winner, throwing 60 passing touchdowns throughout the season. His top targets were none other than future NFL superstars Jamar Chase and Justin Jefferson. If you can think of a better wide receiver duo at the college level, by all means state your case. And when you add this all together, LSU's offense was world-destroying. They scored 726 total points on the season, an average of 48 points per game. But LSU wasn't the only dominant team from this season. In fact, Ohio State, who featured a phenomenal roster and rolled through the Big Ten, actually rated as the nation's strongest team per advanced stats. Quarterback Justin Fields was an All-American and future top 15 draft pick. All-American running back J.K. Dobbins powered the ground game, and the Buckeyes featured their own star wide receiver duo in Chris Olave and Garrett Wilson. And that's before getting to the defense, which featured 2 players who would soon be selected with top 3 picks in the NFL draft. Defensive end Chase Young, who was widely considered the best defensive player in the country that season, and shutdown corner Jeff Okudah. They more than doubled up their opponents in yards per game on the season, averaging 530 yards on offense and giving up only 260. Then you had the rare elite third banana, another undefeated team in Clemson, the defending champions led by a fully unleashed version of Trevor Lawrence. Even 4th seed Oklahoma had an explosive offense led by Jalen Hurts and CeeDee Lamb that torched Big 12 defenses all season long. With these heavyweight matchups set, the semifinals delivered mixed results. Despite the talent on Oklahoma's offense, they served as a punching bag for LSU, allowing nearly 700 yards of offense in a 63-28 rout. But on the other side, Ohio State and Clemson delivered an underrated classic, with Clemson rallying from an early 16-0 deficit and outlasting Ohio State by intercepting Justin Fields in the end zone to win 29-23. Thus, we'll never actually know if that Ohio State team could have hung around with LSU. Still, the national title game had the makings of an all-timer, Clemson chasing its 2nd consecutive title and 3rd in 4 years, and LSU looking to finish their historic season in front of a friendly home crowd in New Orleans. Clemson hung tough early, but LSU's offense was just relentless, amassing over 600 yards of offense and pulling away in the second half, for a 42-25 victory and the program's fourth national championship. At number 5, we have the season that started it all, the inaugural 4-team playoff from the 2014 season, which featured a balanced foursome of contending teams. Alabama entered as the frontrunners, boasting the nation's top-ranked defense, led by star safety Landon Collins, while also featuring the best receiver in the country in Amari Cooper. The Crimson Tide were hungry for redemption after the kick six spoiled their chances at a three-peat the previous season. Number 2 seed Oregon featured the nation's best offense, led by Heisman-winning quarterback Marcus Mariota. Number 3 seed Florida State were the reigning national champions, sporting an impressive 29-game winning streak and the previous season's Heisman winner in Jameis Winston. And lastly, there was Ohio State, who clawed their way into the postseason after a rocky start to the year, suffering a shocking home loss to an unranked Virginia Tech team. Despite that loss, they earned their spot in the playoff with a dominant 59-0 victory over Wisconsin in the Big Ten title game. However, they faced major adversity heading into the playoff, down to their third-string quarterback, Cardale Jones, after losing Braxton Miller and JT Barrett to season-ending injuries. Jones had acclimated himself well in the Big Ten championship, but a playoff matchup with Alabama represented a significant step up in competition. The game looked like a mismatch early on, with the Buckeyes trailing 21-6 after a turnover-plagued start, but Jones and the Ohio State offense then came to life, roaring back to take the lead in the second half. The Buckeyes sealed their victory with 2 iconic plays, a pick six by defensive lineman Steve Miller, and an 85-yard touchdown run through the heart of the South by star running back Zeke Elliott to seal a 42-35 victory. Over in the Rose Bowl, a tight first half between Oregon and Florida State turned into a rout when Florida State unraveled with 4 second-half turnovers, leading to 34 unanswered points by the Ducks in what would become a 59-20 win. In the national title game, Oregon was chasing their first championship in school history after falling heartbreakingly short against Auburn in 2010, while Ohio State was hoping to complete an improbable run with their third-string quarterback. In the end, the Buckeyes offense proved to be the dominant force of the game, with Zeke Elliott once again the star of the show, gaining nearly 250 yards on the ground and scoring 4 touchdowns as Ohio State rolled to a 42-20 win to claim their 8th national title. My 4th-ranked playoff is from the 2022 season, featuring an unforgettable semifinal round. Georgia, who entered the postseason as an undefeated number 1 seed and reigning national champion, was an advanced stats darling, rating as the strongest playoff participant of the entire CFP era. Quarterback Stetson Bennett successfully made the leap from feel-good walk-on to one of the best players in the country, and he was bolstered by elite playmakers like tight end Brock Bowers and wide receivers Ladd McConkey and Adonai Mitchell. And that was arguably their weaker side of the ball, with a top 3 defense led by the dominant presence of Jalen Carter on the defensive line. Challenging Georgia was Michigan once again, who had built on the success of their first playoff appearance the previous year and came back even stronger in 2022. Out went Cade McNamara at quarterback, and in came J.J. McCarthy, with All-American Blake Corum powering a dominant run game. They steamrolled to another Big Ten title, cementing their playoff ticket with a massive 45-23 road victory over an elite Ohio State team. That same Ohio State team still was able to sneak into the playoff field as the number 4 seed, and despite the crushing loss to Michigan, they still proved a major title threat, with star quarterback CJ Stroud and elite receivers in Marvin Harrison Jr. and Emeka Egbuka. By comparison to these 3 teams, number 3 TCU stuck out like a sore thumb, representing the Cinderella story of this postseason. All-American QB Max Duggan and wide receiver Quentin Johnston formed the backbone of a really strong passing attack, but the Horned Frogs rated as one of the weaker playoff teams of the CFP era, with a mediocre defense that ranked 52nd in the country. But their opportunistic defense would rise to the occasion in the semifinals, baiting J.J. McCarthy into 2 pick sixes and mustering just enough explosive plays on offense to upset a heavily favored Michigan team. As 7.5-point underdogs, and considering the status of these two programs entering the game, to me, this was the signature upset of the entire 4-team playoff era. Meanwhile, in the Peach Bowl, Ohio State bounced back dramatically from the Michigan loss, putting Georgia on the ropes with a 38-24 lead in the second half. But Georgia rallied late, with Stetson Bennett once again leading 2 straight touchdown drives in the fourth quarter, including a go-ahead throw to Adonai Mitchell with less than a minute to play. Stroud would drive the Buckeyes into field goal range, but kicker Noah Ruggles missed a 50-yard attempt as time expires, sending Georgia back to the title game and completing the best semifinal round in playoff history. Unfortunately, what holds this season back from the very top of the rankings is the national title game itself, where Georgia treated TCU like a high school team in a 65-7 destruction, the largest margin of victory in title game history. With the win, Georgia became the first team since Alabama in 2012 to win back-to-back national titles. At number 3, we turn the clock back to 2016, a season where the rivalry between Alabama and Clemson reached its peak. After facing off in the previous year's national championship, both teams returned loaded rosters and entered the season with sky-high expectations. Defending champion Alabama faced a key transition at quarterback after Jacob Coker graduated, but freshman Jalen Hurts stepped in seamlessly, immediately winning the SEC's Offensive Player of the Year award. The Tide also featured the nation's top-ranked defense, with standouts like Minkah Fitzpatrick and Marlon Humphrey developing into All-Americans in the secondary, and Jonathan Allen wreaking havoc on the defensive line. Clemson's roster also benefited from another year of experience. Quarterback Deshaun Watson elevated his game to an even higher level, finishing as the Heisman runner-up to a little-known quarterback named Lamar Jackson. And under the tutelage of defensive coordinator Brent Venables, Clemson's defense transformed into an elite unit. Familiar faces like Carlos Watkins and Christian Wilkins dominated up front, while freshman phenoms like Dexter Lawrence and Cleveland Farrell made immediate impacts. Joining Alabama and Clemson in the playoff were number 3 Ohio State and number 4 Washington. Ohio State's inclusion was controversial as the Buckeyes failed to win the Big Ten after a narrow road loss to Penn State. Nevertheless, they still featured the usual cast of future NFL players, despite a less dominant season than usual. Washington, on the other hand, dominated the Pac-12 conference behind future NFL quarterback Jake Browning and explosive wide receiver John Ross, who was a top 10 pick in the 2017 draft. The Huskies, who were making their first playoff appearance at the time, were out to prove that they could contend on the national level. However, it quickly became apparent that Ohio State and Washington were merely supporting characters in the season's narrative. Washington's high-powered offense was stifled by Alabama's defense, mustering less than 200 total yards in a 24-7 defeat. And Ohio State, despite being slight favorites against Clemson in the Fiesta Bowl, suffered a humiliating 31-0 loss, further solidifying the gap between the nation's top 2 powerhouses and the rest of the country. In the end, what will always be remembered from this season is the unforgettable rematch between Alabama and Clemson in the national championship game. Early on, it appeared that Clemson's quest for revenge would go the route of the Red Viper rather than Inigo Montoya, as Alabama surged to a 14-0 lead. But trailing 24-14 early in the fourth quarter, Clemson came alive, scoring 2 touchdowns to take the lead with just over 4 minutes to play. Alabama then responded with championship pride, engineering a go-ahead touchdown drive of their own, capped off by a 30-yard Jalen Hurts touchdown run. But the Tide left just enough time on the clock for Clemson and Deshaun Watson, who put together a masterful drive, culminating in a buzzer-beating touchdown pass to Hunter Renfrow with 1 second left on the clock. The dramatic win delivered Clemson its first national title since 1981 and cemented this game in the annals of college football history. It's fitting that the final year of the 4-team playoff era ended in style, earning its place as my second best postseason. Michigan entered as the frontrunner, an undefeated number 1 seed with a historically dominant defense that held opponents to a little over 10 points per game during the season. But there was plenty of reason to doubt the Wolverines. They'd flopped in their previous 2 playoff appearances, and head coach Jim Harbaugh was mired in a sign-stealing scandal that led to his suspension for the final 3 games of the regular season. So with Michigan at the top, rather than a dominant SEC champion of old, the championship race felt wide open. As for the rest of the playoff field, it consisted of a group of flawed but compelling teams. Number 2 seed Washington had an elite offense led by the All-American combination of QB Michael Penix and wide receiver Rome Odunze, though their 50th ranked defense left them susceptible to close calls throughout the regular season. Number 3 Texas secured a signature road win at Alabama early in the year and cruised to the Big 12 title, but they still remained untested on the playoff stage. And of course, you can't have a playoff without one of the usual suspects, with number 4 Alabama assuming the mantle from this season. This was far from Saban's most dominant Alabama team, but they still had plenty of talent on the defensive side of the ball and an explosive dual-threat quarterback in Jalen Milroe. The semifinals kicked off with a thrilling Rose Bowl clash between Michigan and Alabama. Alabama assumed the rare role of underdogs in this game, but had Michigan on the brink before Michigan mounted a late fourth quarter touchdown drive to force overtime. Blake Corum then bulldozed his way to a touchdown run on the first possession of overtime to give Michigan the lead. And on Alabama's ensuing possession, Michigan's defense made a goal line stand, stuffing Jalen Milroe on a confused fourth down play to secure a signature win and punch their ticket to the national title game. In the Sugar Bowl, Texas and Washington staged a different style of a game with a back-and-forth shootout. But with the game tied at 21 apiece at the half, Michael Penix proved too much for the Longhorns' defense in the end, shredding them for 430 passing yards. Texas nearly pulled off a miraculous rally late, but Washington defended a final pass in the end zone to hold on for the win and advance to the national championship. The title game between Michigan and Washington failed to capture the excitement of the semifinal round, but it was a competitive contest. Michigan jumped out to a 17-3 lead early behind a dominant run game, but Washington was able to claw back to a 20-13 deficit entering the fourth quarter. But in the final period, Michigan would assert themselves with Corum punching in another rushing touchdown to extend the lead, and cornerback Mike Sainristil's dramatic interception and 81-yard return to set up the game's final score, putting an exclamation point on Michigan's first national title since 1997. But for all the theatrics and epic storylines that we've covered thus far, the best postseason of the college football playoff era came in the 2017 season, featuring a group of traditional blue blood programs and one of the most evenly matched fields in recent memory. Ironically, the weakest link was the number 1 seed and reigning national champions in Clemson. The Tigers dominated the ACC yet again, powered by an elite defense, but were missing the offensive magic of the previous years after Deshaun Watson's departure to the NFL. Meanwhile, second-seeded Oklahoma entered the playoff at the height of the Baker Mayfield era. The Heisman-winning quarterback spent the 2017 season throwing to future NFL stars in CeeDee Lamb, Mark Andrews, and Hollywood Brown, and his blind side was protected by All-American left tackle Orlando Brown. The Sooners had proved that they were ready to contend at the highest level, scoring a key road win at Ohio State during the regular season. And a massive challenge laid in front of them because for the first time in the playoff era, the SEC landed not one, but two teams in the field, with number 3 seed Georgia winning the conference title and number 4 Alabama earning a spot despite a late season loss to Auburn. Although both teams entered the field with lower seeds than usual, both rosters were unsurprisingly loaded with talent. Georgia's backfield featured 3 future NFL running backs in Nick Chubb, Sony Michel, and DeAndre Swift, while the nation's best linebacker, Roquan Smith, captained their defense. Alabama's roster was also a who's who of future NFL players. Jalen Hurts was once again the starter at quarterback, and the skill position group and secondary were stock full of future pros like running back Josh Jacobs, receivers Jerry Jeudy, Calvin Ridley, and Devontae Smith, and safeties Minkah Fitzpatrick and Xavier McKinney. Alabama's talent in the secondary would overwhelm Clemson in the Sugar Bowl as the Tide picked off quarterback Kelly Bryant twice in the second half and cruised to a 24-6 victory. But Georgia would find a much stiffer test with Oklahoma in the Rose Bowl. The Sooners' offense was firing on all cylinders early, taking a 31-17 lead into halftime. But Georgia found a way to rally in the second half to force overtime, where they clinched the win on a 27-yard walk-off touchdown by Sony Michel. The matchup was an instant classic, the first overtime game in the Rose Bowl, and the largest comeback in the game's history. The drama would only escalate from there in one of the great national title games. The game had all the stakes, with the historic rivalry between Alabama and Georgia's programs and the mentor-mentee dynamic between Nick Saban and Kirby Smart. Early on, it appeared the Bulldogs and their mentee head coach were well on their way, smothering Jalen Hurts in the Alabama offense and taking a 13-0 lead into halftime. But then came perhaps the most pivotal chess move of Nick Saban's career, benching Jalen Hurts for freshman quarterback Tua Tagovailoa. Tua instantly energized Alabama's offense, throwing 2 second-half touchdowns to tie the game at 20 and force overtime. Georgia struck first in overtime with a field goal, and after sacking Tua on Alabama's first snap, the Dogs seemed poised for victory. But on the very next play, Tua stunned the Bulldogs with an iconic 41-yard touchdown strike to Devontae Smith, sealing Saban's 5th and perhaps greatest national championship. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed the video, please like and subscribe and leave a comment with your thoughts on the rankings. I hope to see you all next time.